Good evening, and let me start by placing us precisely where this begins. Not with a map, not with a border, not with a negotiation table, but with a comment. A comment made by a sitting American president. A comment that, in its phrasing, connected two things that do not usually appear in the same sentence. On one hand, a failed bid for the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize. On the other, a renewed push by the United States to gain control of Greenland. That link was made explicitly, and once it was made, it set off a chain of reactions that extended far beyond Washington. President Trump said that because he did not receive the Nobel Peace Prize, he no longer felt obligated to prioritize peace in the way he previously had. That statement matters not because of tone, but because of consequence. Because in the same breath, the president tied that feeling directly to U.S. policy toward Europe and toward Greenland. Greenland, of course, is not a vague concept or an abstract idea. It is a territory with existing governance, existing alliances, and existing international understandings. And when the president spoke about acquiring it, he did so not as a hypothetical. He spoke about it as leverage. The structure of the argument was simple. If the United States cannot acquire Greenland, then Europe should expect economic consequences. Specifically, the president threatened increased tariffs on European countries. That is not an aside. That is a trade threat. And it came paired with an explanation that centered not on economics or defense, but on a perceived personal slight. Here is where the moment sharpens. Because the Nobel Peace Prize is not awarded by the United States. It is not awarded by the European Union. It is awarded by a Norwegian committee. Yet the response articulated by the president was not directed toward Norway alone. It was directed broadly toward Europe. That is how a single comment became a diplomatic event. European leaders did not treat these remarks as rhetorical. They responded as though they had been put on notice. European nations began signaling that trade retaliation measures were being considered. Not announced, not finalized, but actively examined. That matters because it tells us how seriously the comments were taken. When tariffs are threatened, governments do not wait to see if the threat was emotional or strategic. They prepare. Senior leaders across Europe began planning discussions to address the dispute. Among them, Norway's prime minister. German officials as well. These were not press statements meant for domestic consumption. They were preparations for engagement. And it all flowed from a framing introduced by the president himself. That the absence of a peace prize altered his sense of obligation. There is a quote that captures the emotional center of this moment, without adding anything new. It changes how you hear everything that follows. Because once that framing is out there, every policy statement attached to it carries that weight. This is not about whether Greenland can be acquired. This is not about whether tariffs will be imposed. This is about how motives are communicated, and how quickly those communications can ripple outward. The president's comments did not exist in isolation. They landed in a Europe that is economically interconnected with the United States. They landed in a diplomatic environment that relies heavily on predictability. And they landed in public. There was no closed-door buffer here. The comments were made plainly, and the reaction was equally direct. European officials did not reinterpret them. They did not soften them. They responded to what was said. Trade retaliation was not presented as a threat, but as a possibility under review. That distinction is important. It signals seriousness without escalation. It says, we are listening and we are preparing. And behind that preparation is the recognition that tariffs affect real economies. They affect industries, supply chains, and workers. So when tariffs are invoked as leverage, the response is structural. The president's remarks also shifted the conversation around peace itself. By stating that he no longer felt obligated to prioritize peace, he reframed peace as optional, not abandoned, but conditional. And that condition was tied to recognition. recognition in the form of a prize. That is a remarkable linkage. Not because prizes are new to politics, but because of how openly the connection was stated. There is another short line that lingers here. Words matter when they become policy. Because what followed the comment was not silence. It was movement. European leaders scheduling discussions, governments signaling readiness, trade frameworks being reviewed, all of it flowing from a single, very public reframing. This is where we leave it for now. Not at the resolution, but at the moment when reactions begin to harden into positions. Because once positions form, the space for casual clarification narrows quickly, and the cost of every word rises. So the comments land, and then the waiting begins. Because in diplomacy, the moment after a statement can matter as much as the statement itself. European governments did not rush to microphones with immediate counter-threats. They did not escalate the language. Instead, they did something quieter and often more consequential. They began to plan. European nations signaled that they were considering trade retaliation measures. That phrase matters. Considering. Not declaring, not promising. It is the language of governments that understand the weight of what has just been introduced into the system. The president's remarks tied the potential acquisition of Greenland to the imposition of tariffs on European countries. That linkage did not require interpretation. It was stated directly. And so, European officials treated it directly. Trade retaliation, by definition, is not emotional. It is procedural. It requires legal review, economic modeling, consultation among ministries. That process does not begin unless a threat is taken seriously. And this one was. Senior leaders began arranging discussions. Norway's prime minister was among those planning talks. German officials as well. Again, these are not minor figures. These are senior leaders preparing to address a dispute that now spans diplomacy, trade, and territorial rhetoric. The involvement of Norway carries particular weight because the Nobel Peace Prize is awarded by a Norwegian committee. The president's reference to his unsuccessful bid for the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize places Norway in a unique position. Not as an adversary, not as an arbitrator, but as an unavoidable part of the context. Yet the response was not framed as personal. European leaders did not respond to the prize issue directly. They responded to the policy implications. That distinction is critical because it shows restraint. It shows an effort to keep the discussion anchored in state-to-state relations rather than personal grievance. Still, the connection remained. The president asserted that the failure to receive the Nobel Peace Prize altered his sense of obligation toward peace. And that assertion now sat alongside the threat of tariffs. Europe heard both, and Europe responded to both by preparing for economic consequences. The idea of trade retaliation is not symbolic. It signals that European governments are willing to use the same tools being threatened against them. Tariffs invite tariffs. That is not ideology. That is arithmetic. And once that logic is activated, it moves quickly through bureaucratic channels. Here is where the pacing slows, but the tension increases. Because preparation is invisible. While no tariffs had yet been imposed, the groundwork for response was being laid. Legal teams, trade experts, diplomatic envoys, all working within systems designed for moments like this. The president's comments also placed European governments in a delicate position domestically. They had to demonstrate that they were defending national and regional interests. At the same time, they had to avoid inflaming a situation that could escalate further. That balance is not easy. And it is harder when statements are framed in personal terms. There is a quote that captures this moment without adding anything new. When intentions are stated plainly, reactions follow plainly. Because the clarity of the president's remarks removed ambiguity, there was no need to guess what leverage was being proposed. Greenland, tariffs, peace, and recognition were all named. That naming changed the terrain. European officials planning discussions were not reacting to a policy document. They were reacting to a public declaration. That changes how discussions are approached. Public declarations limit flexibility. They create audiences. They create expectations. And they create records. Once something is said publicly, walking it back is not just a matter of policy adjustment. It is a matter of credibility. European leaders understood that, which is why their response emphasized process rather than rhetoric. Planning discussions, signaling possible measures, not matching tone, but matching seriousness. Germany's involvement is also notable. As one of Europe's largest economies, Germany's position on trade retaliation carries significant weight. When German officials plan discussions, markets pay attention. Supply chains notice. Businesses begin to calculate. So even without action, the signal itself has consequences. This is how diplomatic friction often works. It is not the explosion that causes damage. It is the pressure. The steady increase in uncertainty. And that uncertainty now existed on both sides of the Atlantic. The president's framing of peace as something he no longer felt obligated to prioritize added another layer. Peace is not a single policy lever. It is a guiding principle invoked in diplomacy, alliances, and negotiations. When a leader publicly states that this principle is conditional, partners reassess. Not because they assume immediate conflict, but because they recalibrate expectations. European leaders planning discussions were not only addressing tariffs, they were addressing trust. Trust that agreements will be honored. Trust that disputes will be managed predictably. That trust does not disappear overnight, but it does require maintenance. And moments like this test it. The president's remarks did not specify timelines. They did not outline procedures. They did not detail next steps. That absence of detail is itself consequential, because it leaves space. Space for interpretation. Space for preparation. European governments filled that space with planning. The possible trade retaliation measures being considered were not described publicly, and that silence is intentional. It preserves leverage. It allows for response without pre-commitment. It says, we have options. This is a familiar posture in trade disputes. But the trigger here was unusual. It was not a trade imbalance, not a regulatory disagreement. It was a linkage between territorial ambition and personal recognition. That is what made the moment stand out. Not because it was unprecedented in effect, but because it was unprecedented in explanation. Another short line fits here. Explanations shape reactions. And the explanation offered by the president shaped Europe's response. It shifted the conversation from negotiation to preparation, from dialogue to contingency. As discussions were planned, the diplomatic calendar began to fill. Meetings, calls, briefings, all aimed at addressing a dispute that had not yet fully materialized, but was clearly forming. This is how escalation is often avoided, by taking threats seriously before they are executed. European leaders were signaling that they would not be caught unprepared. They were also signaling that economic pressure would be met in kind. That message was not shouted, it was implied. And implication, in diplomacy, can be powerful. The situation remained unresolved. No tariffs imposed, no trade retaliation enacted, but the lines had been drawn, publicly. And once lines are drawn publicly, they are harder to erase. This is the point at which the narrative pauses, not because nothing is happening, but because everything is being prepared, and preparation, though quiet, is decisive. And so we arrive at the final phase of this moment, not resolution, not agreement, but a kind of stillness that comes when positions have been stated, heard, and absorbed. The president's comments linking his unsuccessful bid for the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize to a renewed push to gain control of Greenland did not fade after the initial reaction. They remained present. They remained uncorrected, and they continued to shape how European governments understood the situation. The assertion that he no longer felt obligated to prioritize peace stayed attached to the policy threats that followed. That pairing did not dissolve with time. It hardened into context. European nations, having signaled possible trade retaliation measures, did not escalate publicly. They did not issue ultimatums. Instead, they maintained readiness. That posture is deliberate. It allows space for dialogue without surrendering leverage. Senior leaders continued planning discussions. Norway's prime minister, German officials. These discussions were framed not as confrontations, but as efforts to address the dispute. That phrasing matters. Addressing a dispute implies it is real. It implies it requires attention. It implies it cannot be ignored. And that is where things stand. The potential for increased tariffs from the United States remains part of the landscape. The potential for European trade retaliation remains part of the response. Neither has been enacted, but both are now plausible. This is often how international disputes exist for long stretches of time, not as events, but as conditions. Conditions that influence decisions quietly. Conditions that shape expectations. Conditions that alter how governments speak to one another behind closed doors. The president's framing of peace as something he no longer felt obligated to prioritize introduced a conceptual shift. It did not change treaties. It did not change alliances. But it changed tone. Tone is not decoration in diplomacy. Tone signals intent, and intent is what partners watch most closely. European leaders planning discussions are not reacting to hypothetical futures. They are reacting to expressed positions. Those positions were expressed clearly. They were not buried in documents. They were spoken. And because they were spoken, they became part of the official record. Trade retaliation measures being considered by European nations are, by definition, defensive. They are responses, not initiations. That framing allows European governments to justify preparation without provoking escalation. It also allows them to demonstrate to domestic audiences that they are attentive and prepared. The absence of immediate action does not indicate indifference. It indicates calculation. The president's comments placed Greenland at the center of a broader transatlantic tension. Greenland itself was not speaking in this moment, but it was being spoken about as an object of acquisition, as leverage. That alone is enough to trigger diplomatic concern, because acquisition implies consent, and consent was not part of the remarks. Instead, acquisition was presented as a condition tied to economic pressure. That presentation reverberated. European governments did not reinterpret it. They took it as stated. There is a line that captures the emotional undercurrent here. When words are left standing, they do their own work. Because words, once released, do not need reinforcement to have effect. They linger. They inform. They shape. The planning of discussions by senior leaders signals that this issue has not been relegated to the margins. It is not being handled quietly at lower levels. It has reached the desks of those responsible for steering national responses. That is a measure of significance. The president's unsuccessful bid for the Nobel Peace Prize remains what it was, an outcome decided elsewhere. But by tying that outcome to his sense of obligation toward peace, the president elevated it into the realm of policy explanation. That elevation cannot be undone by silence. It has already been heard. European leaders have responded not by contesting the premise, but by managing the implications. Trade retaliation, if enacted, would not be symbolic. It would be material. It would affect goods, prices, and relationships. That is why the mere consideration of such measures carries weight. It signals that economic interdependence is now being viewed as a tool rather than a constant. That shift is subtle, but consequential. The situation does not end with a declaration. It does not end with a meeting. It exists as an open question. Will tariffs be imposed? Will retaliation follow? Will discussions diffuse the tension? None of that is answered here. What is clear is the sequence that brought us to this point. A statement linking personal recognition to policy posture. A threat tying territorial ambition to economic pressure. A measured European response focused on preparation rather than provocation. And ongoing plans for discussion at the highest levels. This is not a dramatic climax. It is something quieter. It is the kind of moment where systems are tested without breaking, where relationships are strained but not severed, where the future remains undecided. Another short quote fits here. This is how it pauses. Because pauses in international affairs are not empty. They are full of calculation, full of listening, full of watching. The president's comments remain part of the record. European signals of possible trade retaliation remain on the table. Senior leaders' planned discussions remain scheduled. Nothing has been resolved, but nothing has been ignored. And that is where we leave it. Not with closure, but with clarity about where things stand. A moment defined not by action, but by preparation. Not by escalation, but by readiness. Not by silence, but by what has already been said.